Okay, we are here with Jon Behrens, pastor at Restoration Messianic Fellowship in Boulder, Colorado. Um, Jon is a retired lieutenant colonel, Army, was a, uh, trying to remember I can't remember all the units you said you commanded, but that was 23 years of experience in command of a lot of people, helping people to become men and women from all kinds of different backgrounds. And since then, another 23 years at the head of a congregation. And not to mention being a father and a grandfather. And that is a lot of experience turning young people into functioning, productive adults. And we are mostly here to talk about the fifth commandment, honor your father and your mother, and what that means, what it means for sorry, kind of stumbling over my words here. Um, what is the purpose of honoring your father and mother? How does that affect lives? Um, what happens when you do? How does that guide your life for the future? Have a good foundation with your parents. Um, so, Jon, if you want to add anything to that, introduce yourself. If you wanted to tell us about any ministry projects that you've got going on, give your website address, any other contact information you'd like.
Sure. Nothing special to add, but since you let me plug my website, it's crimsonthread.com. That's my teaching website. The congregation website is just out there. So if you want to connect with me, go through crimsonthread.com. Been thinking about this for a while, ever since we talked a couple of weeks ago. And the idea of honoring your father and your mother has become, in lots of cases, foreign to us. And what I will suggest, I want to start with a couple of scriptures. And the first one is, and I'm going to turn my head here because I got my Bible over on the screen. The first one is Colossians 3:18 through 21. Wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke your children lest they become discouraged. That last thing is, fathers, do not provoke your children lest they become discouraged. On our Tuesday Bible study, we're doing Samuel 1 and 2. And I saw a program from Hillsdale College, and I don't remember the professor's name, but one of the things that he mentioned, and when you pay attention to it, it just leaps right out at you, is the first two books of Samuel's are a chronicle of fatherhood failure. So you start with Eli, the priest, and he's got two corrupt sons, and God lays that right at him, and his sons are so corrupt that God basically takes them out and takes him out. And then the next guy is Samuel himself. Samuel, prophet, judge of Israel, etc. But by the time he's old, his sons are not following in his ways. And so Israel rejects choosing his sons to follow after him and instead demands a king. And again, this is because of a failure of fatherhood. And then you look at David, and David, for all of being a man after God's own heart, was a colossal failure as a father. And he has one of his sons rape one of his daughters. He has another of his sons murder that first son. He has another of his sons run him out of town and try and take over the kingdom from him, and that son gets killed. So the thread there, at least as I see it, is fathers who are too busy to deal with their children, because Eli's the high priest. Samuel is the judge of all Israel. David is the king. And what you wind up having is young men. And by the way, you were very kind to say helping young men and young women. I've mostly been involved with young men.
It's the nature of the Army, but
so the idea here is you have fathers who are basically disengaged. Fast forward to us. What we have now is fathers who are also disengaged because of the breakdown of marriage. I'm sure you know your history better than I do, being the history carper. But by the way, plug his books. His history books are good too. It used to be the case that when a marriage broke up, the father got the children. That changed with feminism. And so what has happened is divorce now, instead of being really painful, because in a previous situation, if a woman decided to leave her husband, she had to leave her children behind, which is very, very difficult. And in the previous situation, if a man decided he wanted to go off and find somebody else, he could not leave his children behind. They came with him. So the setup was designed to make divorce unattractive to both parties. Now it's reversed. So basically we have fathers who become basically nothing more than checkbooks, and you have children who don't have the discipline of a father. And as somebody once said, mothers cuddle, fathers poke. And again, you're talking about Cameron with his grandfather. Young men need that, and so do young women. And what's happened now is all of this stuff we're seeing in Scripture about honoring your father and your mother starts with father and mother. So if the father and the mother are not laying a background or a foundation, if you will, then the child, when it grows up, isn't going to honor them. Now, let me switch to another passage of Scripture. I'm in Malachi, chapter 4, very end. Behold, I will send Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes, and he will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the land with a decree of utter desolation. King James has with a curse. So God in Malachi, it seems to me, anticipates exactly where we are. You've got fathers disconnected from their children. And of course, if the children haven't grown up with their father, then honoring your father and your mother is sort of a non-starter. I mean, there are lots of reasons why people are angry, but that's a big one, is they're disconnected, they're rootless, they don't have a background. And then honor your father and your mother. This is the one with that it will go well with you. They don't have a background to do that. So it doesn't go well with them because God's word is what it is. In other words, a strong family and carrying on and the experience, if you will, that grandparents bring to children and so forth is all missing. And so that's a great source of a lot of the discontent and dysfunction that we see. Now, there's other things too. It's not all that, but that's a big chunk of it. And as I say, my perspective here is that honor your father and your mother has to start with father and mother raising the children. And so if father and mother have abrogated the responsibilities to raise the children, then there basically isn't any way for the children then to reciprocate with biblically appropriate honor. So it made sense?
Yeah. What you're saying about what you're saying about Malachi, how Scripture tells us what's going to happen if we don't raise our children right, and it's all laid out for us. We don't really have to guess. I can't remember who it was. It reminded me of a quote that I read a couple of months ago I want to say it was Dwight Moody, somebody of that era.
Sure.
And he said, I don't need to read the newspapers to find out what depravity is going on out there in the world. I just have to read the scriptures and it tells me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And there is nothing that we are seeing right now that hasn't been done before. As Ecclesiastes says, it all comes around. And so all of the pathologies that we're seeing have been there before. And sadly, we also know what the remedies are. And that's when God finally decides, you guys have had enough. And you wind up with lots of hairy Romans or Babylonians overrunning your country when you can't govern yourselves. And I fear we're perilously close to that.
It does seem like it. Last week we talked to my dad, who has a lot of experience in prison ministry. In he's been working with mostly troubled youth for I want to say close to 40 years. People who used to be troubled youth. He worked with troubled youth in the 80s, and since then it's been their adult versions. And there's a lot to talk about when you get into pathologies. All the bad mistakes that people make in parenting or as children, and how that unfolds into a disaster of a life. We talk about that all day long. It's a lot harder to talk about what goes right. So I'm curious if you have some thoughts about what can parents do right to counteract the insanity that we see in the world around us.
Glad you asked. Stay married.
Yeah.
No, I'm dead serious. Parenting is by its nature on the job training. Scripture helps. A community around you helps. There's all sorts of things that help, but there is no substitute for a mother and a father in the house raising their children. I was listening to Ron Dart the other day. He's unfortunately dead now. He's from Texas. And he did a series on marriage, a couple of months ago. And basically he says, I don't care whether you're happy in your marriage or not. It's not about you. It's about the children. And if you are selfish and break up your marriage because you personally are not happy, what you've done is you have basically set your children up with 2 strikes against them and a fast one come on over the plate, as my wife says. So the first advice is hang in there, stay with it, stay married. It's not entirely about you. It's also about your children.
Yeah, I can speak from personal experience that being a single parent is far from the ideal for children. It might make you feel better at times, but nobody can be both mother and father.
No.
Doesn't matter how versatile you are, you just can't do it.
I understand, and I completely agree. Contrary to what our modern society seems to be doing in its latest insanity, men and women are different, and they're designed differently, and they're designed differently from conception. And they fill different roles. Have I gone through my male and female thing with you, Jay?
Probably. Depends on how far back that goes.
Not very. One of the things that happens in our society right now is women want to be doctors and lawyers and Indian chiefs, and they sort of regard being a mother and a home builder as not very important. And so I think it was Chesterton, may have been Chesterton or C.S. Lewis, I don't remember which. But the whole idea is all of society exists to support the homemaker. In other words, you go to work to get resources and so forth. But male and female is fundamental to the structure of the universe. And male is initiative and female is executive, which is to say, and I use the example of human biology, the amount of actual material that the man contributes to a child is microscopic. the seed that he plants. The seed is just a thumb drive, and what he's doing is he's giving her information, his DNA. She then takes that information and she executes. So she's the one that provides all of the material to make a baby. And so feminine is executive, male is initiative. And God is initiative. All he gives us is information. God said, and it was. God said, let there be. And that's just information, words. But the earth and humanity is feminine to God's masculine. And in humanity, you got humanity feminine, boys, and humanity feminine, girls. But in relation to God, who is initiative, we're executive. So our function is to execute, to make things happen in the world. So I found that as I talk about men and women, the women don't bristle nearly so much with that kind of an explanation, because executive is important. Because without the executive, the initiative has no way to make his vision real. It takes the executive.
Yeah.
And without the initiative, the executive is barren. She has nowhere to go. And as I say, talking about men and women is a minefield in our culture, sadly.
Yeah.
And I find that I was talking to a CU student, lady, very liberal, and I explained things to her that way. And she looked at me and said, I've never heard anybody say that way. That makes a lot of sense. And instead of, the typical defensive snarkiness, we had a nice conversation. Because, as I say, the feminine role is executive, which is extremely important. And the male, now the downside of that, by the way, and there is a downside, is the feminine thinks, I'm doing all the work, I should be in charge. And no, I'm very serious.
You got it. You nailed it. That's so true.
Yeah, and that's God decided that no, that's not the way it's going to work. And as I say, it's the natural reaction of the feminine is, hey, I'm doing it all here. Why do I have to listen to him? And God says, because.
Yeah, so, reminds me of that famous line, don't call me sir, I work for a living.
Yes, I understand. Yeah, every NCO in the world uses that one. But as I say, going back to parents and children, again, if the roles are not understood, you wind up with all sorts of pathologies. And there's a tremendous variation in successful human families. You can have quiet men, strong women. You can have strong men, quiet women. They can all be made to work. Some of them are harder than others, but they can all be made to work. And at least in my observation, the biggest thing is both of those roles being available for the child to observe and learn from as he's growing up. And as I say, right now, divorce is epidemic. You've got young men are frustrated because basically the young women are pumped full of all this stuff. And if you look at, your protests, Black Lives Matter, all these kinds of things, they're overwhelmingly young women. And so young men are looking around and saying, who can I marry? I want to start a family, which is what I'm designed to do. And I can't find anybody that wants to start a family with me. And so you've got angry men because they can't start families. You got angry women because they've been sold the movement now is, I can remember when I first got married, mother-in-law's advice to her daughter: make sure you finish your education in case this doesn't work. So she's going into the marriage spring-loaded for failure.
Mm-hmm.
And as opposed to, you and your husband have got to make this work. And having a plan B exit plan is not a good idea. And so young women have been taught that in order to be a fulfilled young woman, you've got to have a degree and so forth, and that takes until your mid-20s, and your peak fertile years are then past. When I was working at CU, University of Colorado, for those of you outside, there's a lady in the office who's had a friend who was a real estate lady. And this gal was the number one real estate lady in Boulder, Colorado, just a hotshot go-getter. And she planned to get married at 35 and start having a family. Well, her plan almost worked. She got married at 35, but she never had a family because she missed those years. And so she winds up being angry. I don't know whether her husband was angry or not. I never met the man. But again, all of this family pathology that we got going on goes back to honor your father as your mother. Because if the family's broken, then the children have no relationship, and B, no understanding. And there's an old book written in the 40s or 50s by a country doctor by the name of Joe Peck.
Mm-hmm.
And it's titled All About Men, and by an old country doctor. And one of the things he said about young boys is two things, actually. When you spank the kid, go at it like you're beating snakes. The kid will appreciate the show. And I don't know how many young men that I've talked to over the years. You remember, no, you wouldn't have known, his different church, talking about his dad that had a belt. And his comment was he drew it like a scimitar. And you're laughing and I'm laughing. But you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing,
put the fear of dad in them.
Huh?
Put the fear of dad in them.
Absolutely. The fear and the love. I mean, the fear is that he loves you enough to stay around and invest that kind of effort in you. And the other thing that it said is, take your kid to church and make him sit there beside you and make him be quiet.
Mm-hmm.
Awe and the atmosphere will at some point permeate. So those were the two pieces of advice. I mean, there are lots of other pieces of advice that I had, but those are the two that stuck with me. And in fact, that's how I came to faith, is my dear wife, who was raised Catholic, insisted that our children be baptized. I was nothing. And so we decided on the Episcopal Church, Catholic light, 1/3 less guilt. And I, took the kids to church, and I held the baby. And I took the baby into the back of the room when she started crying. And I didn't have to listen to any of this. I didn't have to do any of this, but I had to be there. And at some point, it started to click. And that was the thing that got me to where I am now.
Mm-hmm.
Just the atmosphere, the worship, if you will. It worked on me, even though at that point I was in my 40s and didn't have any particular need or use for God at that point. But that, over time, worked on me and turned me into who I am now, which is a rabid Messianic that loves the Bible. And again, as I say, I keep coming back to fathers because, at least in our society, fathers are the ones that are typically missing.
Yeah.
And I mean, as you know, having been a single father, it's hard the other way too. But statistically, you are not in the majority of single parents.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them are women. Anyway,
Yeah.
I'm chattering. Go ahead. You got something to say?
Something you mentioned on your first point about staying married, there
Mhm.
not being any substitute for mother and father being there in the house.
Yep.
Again, going back to my own personal experience, there's no substitute for having good counsel, whether that's your church family or your own extended family. And I think that the easy mobility that modern technology has created
Mhm.
has done the family a huge disservice,
Mhm.
because it is so easy to just pick up and move a state away
Yep.
and never see your extended family again. And parents, even if they're together, you can't figure it out on your own.
Yep.
I mean, you'll never be ready until you're married. You'll never be ready to be a parent until you're a parent.
Yep.
But you're still never going to be ready unless you have those other parents to help you and to teach you their lessons.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And it's interesting you said that, because the trade-off that our society has made is this mobility that we have developed has enabled us to be materially very prosperous.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, being able to pick up and go take a job in New York, and then 3 or 4 years later take another job in Phoenix.
Yeah.
That
creates another illusion that prosperity creates another illusion that we don't need that family.
Correct. And one of the things that, scripture at least as well as I do, God over and over and over again says prosperity is dangerous. And it's interesting because he uses prosperity to motivate us. He says, if you walk with me, I'm going to bless you, and you're going to be really prosperous, and your animals are not going to miscarry, and just all sorts of wonderful things are going to happen if you follow me. But then when they do follow him and they get really, really, really prosperous, then they fall away. And the society then goes downhill, and we have exile and all of that stuff that happens next. So where we are right now is probably past the peak prosperity in this country.
Mm-hmm.
That was probably back in the 50s or 60s. And there's still a whole lot of wealth here, but we're sort of on the downhill side of that curve. But the downside to it is, wealth makes you feel independent, but it also, with that mobility, tears up communities. One of the things that we used to say in the Army, command in the Army was, depending on where you were in combat, it was 1 year. In peacetime, it was 2 years. And somebody wrote an article saying, what we have is sharecropper commanders. They come in there for a short period of time, and they're trying to make their mark. And so their instinct is to spend all that wealth so that they look really good, and then leave behind them a mess that somebody else is going to have to clean up. That again is the downside, if you will, of prosperity. But you're right, it destroys communities because people are transient. So
Mm-hmm.
if you take your job, move from your job in New York to Phoenix, and you're only in Phoenix for 2 or 3 years, yeah, you may join a church, and it may be a very good church, but you don't develop the deep relationships that decades develop, and you don't get the counseling. Because it takes you a while to figure out who you can trust.
Mm-hmm.
And so
it takes them a while to figure out if you're going to hear what they have to say.
Exactly. And that all takes time. Human relationships takes time, which is, again, going back to why I said stay married, because raising a child is something that takes decades. And in fact, longer than that, as you said, with the extended family, because you're still involved with your children and grandchildren and so forth. And Rush Limbaugh once said something that I thought was really very insightful. When his father passed away, he said, I have lost a great resource. And that was his attitude toward his
Mhm.
father. When his father passed, I've lost a tremendous resource. Somebody that I could talk to, that I didn't have to worry was somehow going to exploit what they learned about me. So yeah, you're right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's about 7:40,
Mhm.
and we have a few people here in the live call with us.
Okay.
So I'd like to open it up, see if anybody has any questions or any observations they'd like to share.
Very good.
So there aren't a bunch of us, so just go ahead and unmute yourself. You're ready.
Okay, I'll start.
Uh-huh.
Well, thanks, John, for all of this. It's been very insightful, and this is a subject that I'm very, very passionate about for a variety of reasons. And just to prove you how passionate I am on it, I'm actually on the Boy Crisis book, and I'm almost done with it. And everything that you said, it's here. You know, the writers are not. I believe, I'm pretty sure they're not necessarily believers, but they do have a part that does say that, you know, faith in God is extremely important. And this book goes through, it has so much data and so many facts that at the end of the day, you know, you can't debate it, right? It's just right there. And one of the things you mentioned earlier is the, you know, first of all, we do have a boy crisis. Culture and society have just destroyed the male figure to where we're the enemies now. And we're the enemies to everybody, you know, and women see us as the enemy now. And I started feeling this probably like 20 years ago when I thought twice about opening the door for a woman, because I was like, well, she may not, you know, like that. I'm opening the door for them, you know. Thankfully, I pushed through that, and I said, you know what, I'm going to keep on doing it regardless. But
there you go. Good for you.
yeah, but you know, it's really done some damage for boys, and I've seen it. And you're right, the divorce is one of the biggest damages that's happened. I've had countless friends of mine wanting to have divorce, and me and my small wisdom, for whatever reason, just because, well, not even small wisdom, just from a lot of reading, because I'm so passionate about this, I've given the same advice. I said, look, I understand you're not happy, but you got to push through this just for the kids, man. After that, I don't know what to tell you, but it's so important for you to be there and just take it in the chin if you have to forever, because it's not about you anymore. It's about them. And thankfully, every single one of them have stayed there, and they're not happy, but you know, they're just pushing through it. So it's a great thing. And you're right, best parents are both, and it's right here in the book itself. They claims that as well. And I found it interesting that, you know, what you said also, if divorce does happen, and I had a feeling I was right about this, and the book proved it, to where boys do better, boys and girls do better with the father than with the mother. And when I share people that, they're completely blown away by that one fact. I tell them all the other things, that, you know, boys are more likely to fall into drug abuse, boys are more likely to commit suicide, boys are more likely to, you know, be in prison. You know, there's data after data, their health, obesity, all kinds of things that boys are affected by. And, you know, the biggest thing is, to me, is the father is so important to have a relationship with God, because if they don't have that male figure there, and whether people like to understand or not, you know, understand that God's a spirit, but he represents himself as a male figure, right? So when you remove the father from that, which our court system and our culture has done an excellent job at executing to that, then they no longer understand what is God. They don't understand that discipline means love, that I love you, that's why I discipline you. And they don't get that. They don't understand that instructions are there, it's for your life. So that hurts too. So with all that said, that was just my comment. Here's my question to you is, where do we go from here? Because it's just so, I don't see, I have hope and faith in him, obviously, but I don't see a way out. I see kids just not, this generation is just doesn't seem like it's gonna make it. It just doesn't seem that way, and it's almost like it has to be collapsed so it can be rebuilt again. But there are a few of us that, you know, I myself have been affected by the culture. I'm paying myself for the consequences of not knowing the Father early on in my life, for not understanding him, for not having a relationship with him. And I'm paying for those consequences, right? And many of us are, because we came late to an understanding of the relationship with him. So those of us who have now that understanding, what do we do with the next generation? What do we change besides giving the word of the Father, for sure? You know, and in my mind, I want you to add to this is understand that what the world has to offer us is death. It doesn't have anything for us, you know. So the whole trying to move up the corporate ladder and make more money, you know, try to do more things, you know, try to give the kids everything that you didn't have, that didn't work. Like you said, jumping around in communities, you know, jumping around from job to job, that's not working either. So what do we do?
Okay, I got a couple of observations from what you said. You said that boys need a father for all of the reasons, and I agree. Girls do too. And it turns out that girls who grow up without a father wind up promiscuous and quickly pregnant because they don't have that male figure in their life and they're looking for it. So you find that girls who grow up without a father have a different set of pathologies, but they're every bit as bad. The other thing is, you mentioned God set things up in hierarchy. In other words, he's at the top, and then you have a pyramid below him. In the wilderness, Moses, God tells him, all right, what you do is you set up commanders of thousands, commanders of hundreds, commanders of 50s. That's hierarchy. Our society doesn't like hierarchy. Our society wants everything flat and equal. And that's a big part of the problem that we have, is that hierarchy has gotten a bad word. So what next? That was your basic question. And there's a pastor up in Idaho that I read by the name of Doug Wilson. He's a Presbyterian. You know him? Okay. Yeah.
I know Doug. He got good stuff.
Yeah. He's a Calvinist, so we disagree theologically, but boy,
Sure.
Everything else he's got is really, really good. So I spend a lot of time reading him. And he's concerned with the same thing. And his thing is, the only thing that is going to work is if God steps in and gives us revival. And I tend to agree with that. And that's the prayers that my wife and I say every evening, is tell God that we have messed up, we have sinned, we have squandered all the blessings he's given us, and ask him to have mercy upon us and send us revival. And the other thing we pray is, please confuse and scatter the liberals. So
I can get behind that.
And I think Doug Wilson will agree with that too. Yeah.
Well, the other is, to use an old Texasism, bloom where you're planted. You've got to keep talking to people. My wife and I both have this thing that when people ask us how we are, I say, I am greatly blessed and beloved of God, with a big smile. And you'd be surprised how many people all of a sudden brighten up and say, me too. And my wife, who is far more outgoing than I am, she's spontaneously speaking. I'm not, I'm an introvert. She finds herself sitting in dentist's office and striking up conversations, starting with that, and talking to people and getting their attention, and finding out that we're not so alone, which is wonderful. But Christ's mission to us was go out there and make disciples of all nations. And one of the pathologies of the church is what I call pietism, which is to say, I'm going to heaven and I'm going to stay out of the way. I'm going to stay out of trouble. I'm going to keep quiet because I'm going to heaven and that's it. Well, that's dropping out. Those people are basically sidelined and casualties in the culture war because they're not fighting. So, yes, it's a wonderful thing that they're perhaps going to heaven, but the mission is take other people with you. And so, as I say, I'm an introvert. I don't usually start conversations in the store. My wife does. But, mine is I teach and I pastor. I do this kind of stuff. So prayer first, that God would have mercy on us and give us revival. And then out there, basically being your own one-man little wrecking crew. And your instinct to hold doors open is exactly right, okay? That's spiritual warfare. What you're doing is you are not capitulating to a culture that you don't agree with. And what you're saying is, I'm a man. I have been taught to be a gentleman. I am going to behave that way regardless of how you take it. In other words, how you take it is not my problem. How I behave is my problem, and I'm going to behave in a godly, gentlemanly, respectful manner. And so, again, as, sort of the old Texas proverb, bloom where you're planted. Prayer, replicating yourself, in other words, seeing how many people you can influence. The other one you can do among friends is encouragement. One of the things that we have is we all seem to be agreeing right now, nodding our heads, that we are sort of in the pre-Babylonian invasion stage right now. And I'm sort of hoping we're not in the pre-Sodom and Gomorrah stage. Understand that in God's economy, exile is therapeutic. So when Israel gets to the point where they cannot govern themselves and they stink like dirty diapers, God then finally says, you can't govern yourselves, so I'm going to bring somebody in who will govern you for a while. You guys want to do idols? Okay, we'll send you to Idol Central. And he sends them off to Babylon. You guys can't get along. Oh, okay. So you crucified my son. Baseless hatred. Fine, we'll get that straightened out. And you're up to your hips in Romans. And so God's remedies are harsh when they need to be, but they're therapeutic. And so I think the only hope we have of avoiding being up to our hips in Russians or Chinese or Cubans or something, I don't know who, but is to get on our faces, repent, and encourage one another to do the same. Encourage one another that they're not alone. Encourage one another that the things that they are doing are helping. And because we can very easily get isolated and feel isolated when we're inundated with all of the negative stuff. In fact, I have quit reading negative stuff before bed. I sleep much better. I got enough negative stuff during the day that I don't read any before I go to bed. And again, encouragement. You're doing the right thing. You're doing what God told you to do. He may not pat you on the head every 20 minutes, but understand that if you're following the directions and you're doing your best, you're doing what he wants you to do. Leave the results to him. He just says, do what I told you to do, and I'll take care of the results. So that would be my advice.
Yeah, I'd like to add something to that too. That,
You bet.
The specific advice you gave whether the United States continues to last as an entity or not, there will be people here.
Yes.
There may be some other people, maybe some other government, but that same advice works in every country.
Mm-hmm.
You can keep being persistent in sharing the word and in standing against a debased culture, even if it's not this culture.
Yep.
So, and that will help build something better to replace whatever. I mean, if God brings the United States down, he's going to replace it with something else. And maybe we can make that better.
Yep. And as I am very fond of saying, when the Roman Empire fell, there did not cease to be Italians.
Mm-hmm.
And
their accents might have changed a bit.
What's that?
Their accents might have changed a bit.
Yeah, but and it'll be the same with the United States. If God decides he's done with us as an entity, there will still be Americans, and we'll still have the scriptures, and we'll still know, and we'll still be able to continue to do whatever it is we're called to do.
True. Thank you, John. So it's pray, get to work, and be an encourager. Yeah. That's the three things that I grab from you. And yeah, appreciate that. Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Hi, Heidi. See your hand up there.
Hey, I am really glad that Paula texted me and reminded me this was happening tonight. I got busy. But thank you for your time and your wisdom and your insight, John. I really, really appreciate that. A couple of thoughts that I had along the way was I really appreciated that you focused on how to grow as parents, not on parenting styles, because I see so much of this with young families. It wasn't so much when my kids are, I'm not on video and you're welcome, but it's been a day. My kids are 25 and 23, and so we're in the grandparent stage of this. But when they were little, it wasn't so much about all the parenting styles. It was just a lot of just rejecting what had come before, more so than crafting our own. But now watching my son and my daughter-in-law and a lot of these young families, there's so much focus on parenting styles. And some of them, I just shake my head and go, that's delightful in theory. Good luck. I wish you the best. But what I think is really important is parent growth. And I put this on the Common Sense Bible Study briefly the other day. Jay was asking about honoring parents, is that I was not raised with parents that were easy to honor, and they were not always honorable, especially my mother was, and I do not have a good relationship. And so I have had to make conscious choices to behave in ways that are honorable, regardless of her behavior. Mm-hmm. And what that has prompted, lately some discussion between my husband and I is, how do we become parents who are easy to honor? It's still a choice of my children to decide to honor me. I get that's their free will, but I don't want to make it harder by behaving in ways that are selfish or destructive or whatever.
Yeah,
good question.
Yeah, that's why I started this whole thing a while back with this quote from Colossians. In the end of Colossians 3, I believe it is. 3:18. The advice to fathers there is, do not be harsh with your children because it discourages them. So the first thing I would suggest is, and by the way, let me not forget this. My wife handed me a note during the what can we do stage. And her insight, which is correct, is teach the young boys from Proverbs. Proverbs is set up in 31 chapters, which means you can read a chapter every day. And Proverbs, interestingly enough, are sometimes difficult to understand because it's what's called in Hebrew mashalim, which is basically contrasting things playing off each other, and they're intended to spark discussion. Sierra, yeah. When my boys were growing up, we had a feral young man that played with them, and that was when I was starting to get into this. So every afternoon at like 3:00, I would round up the boys, and this feral young man would show up with them, and we'd sit down and we'd read Proverbs. And the first time we did that, this young man said, "Are you going to do this tomorrow?" Because, again, he was from a broken family, didn't have good parents, that, good role models, if you will. And the idea of a father sitting down with him and going through Proverbs with him, and in addition to my own sons. I mean, I was doing it for them. He just sort of tagged along, but he became a regular because people weren't teaching him that. So part to answer your question, Heidi, is God provides us in books like Proverbs with wisdom on how, as you say, not to become a parent that's hard to honor. And part of it is, I would say, part of it is not being selfish. And in other words, the divorce problems that we have right now are, the seed of that is this culture of selfishness we have, where it's all about me. And if you pay attention to your behavior, and I have a phrase that I use when we're teaching Musar, learn to think about what you're thinking about. And that sounds harder than it actually is. But as you get reactions to things in your mind, think about how you got there. What were you thinking about that you finally got to this place where you're about to do something stupid? What was the train of thought that got you there? And as you go back and audit that, what you're going to find is things about yourself that you don't realize that are pathological. Everybody is born with pathology. Nobody's born perfect. Sorry. Nobody gets issued that way. And the whole idea of community and so forth and parents is to knock the edges off those parts of you that are not pleasing. You can help in that process. And the way you help in that process is, as I say, learn to think about what you're thinking about. So when you find yourself about to lose your temper, or you find yourself about to say something snarky or whatever, pause for a second. You can still say it if you want to, but pause for a second and audit what you were thinking about that got you there. And one of the things
that's really good.
Yeah, one of the things you'll find is there'll be commonalities. Like, so for example, I used to have a real problem with resentment. I was a consulting engineer for a while. And the thing about being a consultant who doesn't get a regular paycheck is you sort of depend on people to send you your consulting fees on a timely basis. And somebody would delay paying me for the work I'd done. And I'd be taking an afternoon walk, and all of a sudden I would be just in a rage. I'd stop and think, how did I get here? What was going on? And what I would discover is it started with, how dare they treat me like that? I am an important person. How dare they disrespect me? And what I discovered was it was pride. And it took me a while. I will not say that I figured this out in 20 minutes. It took weeks. But what I discovered was I had a spirit of pride going on here. And once I realized that that's what I had, then I could work on it. But if you don't realize what the problem is, then working on it becomes sort of a shotgun thing. You may hit it or you may not. Did I say it so it made sense?
No, absolutely, absolutely. My sons have given us the gift of constant introspection by challenging everything all the time. My younger son is currently in rehab, which is one of the most beautiful things I've been able to say in a long time. Sorry.
No, I'm sorry to hear that.
Don't worry about it.
No, it's good. He's alive to go, and we're thankful.
Yes.
But we are spending a lot of time in the learn to think what you're thinking about stage right now. Mm-hmm. How did we get here? What did because there's never been a doubt that our children were loved. They've always been loved. But how that love was filtered through our own brokenness and how that manifested God to them and all of that. And it's been brutal, but honestly, I can say that it has been a gift that our sons have given us these last few years of things not being easy, has challenged us to examine ourselves, not to blame them. I mean, they are men who are responsible for their own lives, but to see what are the ways we can perpetuate negative patterns and what are the ways that we can grow up ourselves, mature ourselves, and become more like Yahweh, more like Yeshua to them. Interesting side note is that this is the second rehab he's been to in the last couple of months. The first one didn't work out. And the first one didn't work out because they kept wanting him to tell them how bad his parents were. And he wouldn't do it.
Good.
He wouldn't do it. He was like, what I've done is me, and I've got my issues, but I've never doubted that my parents loved me. And they couldn't understand that. And it's the little things. We're just going to be really thankful for that. But God has so many fingerprints all over my son's lives.
Oh,
and it's amazing. If he can survive building his testimony, it's going to be amazing.
Yeah, I really hope that one didn't have a dramatic testimony, but I understand what you're saying.
Go
ahead.
No, that was all. I just, what you're saying, learn to think about what you're thinking about. That probably encapsulates the last 4 months of my life more than any other phrase. That's really what we've been doing.
Let me give you a practical resource. There's a Jewish discipline. It's called Musar, spelled Mussar. And it's not Christian, it's Jewish. So don't look for Christ and the Holy Spirit in it. But what it is a systematic way of inventorying who you are. And just think about what you're thinking about. I use that when I teach Musar. And if you want a taste of it, on crimsonthread.com, over in videos, scroll down to Musar, and they're in reverse order. So number 1 is at the bottom. And it is a structured, systematic way to profitably learn who you are. And then it's got exercises to help work on those parts of yourself that you don't find pleasing. As I say, nobody is issued perfect, but we're all messed up in different ways. So when we come together in community, the fact that I've got a raging spirit of pride and you may have some other thing, we can work with each other. And sometimes that working with each other is conflict, other times it's not. But that's the reason we're in community is because, it's the old proverb, iron sharpens iron. And if you expect that you were born perfect, you're in for a sad awakening. And of course, you're all adults, so you're not. But I highly recommend Musar as a systematic way to go about figuring some of that stuff out.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'll look into that. So thank you again for all of your insight. I'll release the floor to somebody else.
Thank you, Heidi. I want to add something to that too. For also being an introvert, I sure do seem to talk a lot around here. But that idea of thinking about what you're thinking about, that's also great marriage advice. I found when Paula and I first got married, we were very different kinds of people. And there were a lot of conflicts, a lot of rough edges that needed to be knocked off. And I found myself getting defensive a lot. And frequently I didn't even realize it until later. I would realize that I was angry because I was being, insecure or defensive about something. But I had to think about it. I mean, as soon as I realized that I was getting angry or something was going wrong, it may not be until afterwards, but just sitting there and thinking about, okay, what went wrong here? Was there something actually that I should have been defensive about, or was I just being overly sensitive about something? Was there really a problem here, or all just in my imagination? And that was very helpful for both Paula and I to work out a lot of our differences early on.
Yep.
All right. Anybody else have a question or anything they'd want to say? Okay. Oh, Paula just unmuted herself. Oh, that was an accident. Okay. All right. Well, Jon mentioned his website, crimsonthread.com. So there are a lot of great teaching resources there. I really encourage you to check it out. I'm working through his series on Revelation right now, because that's in the batter's box for us in our, as soon as we're done with Acts, or maybe before we get to the end of the book of Acts, I'm not sure which, we're going to be talking about the book of Revelation. So, and that's a tough one. Also, a couple of reminders. We've got, we are working through the book of Proverbs on Thursday nights. We're on Proverbs 22 this week. So everybody, the more input, the more people we've got to talk about it, the more interesting and helpful these conversations are. And for April 7th, which is early first fruits, actually it'll be after sunset, so it won't really be first fruits anymore. We're going to have Ryan White talking about the spring feasts. So I think that'll be a really great conversation too. And if there's nothing else, then I guess we'll call that quits. And Jon, I really appreciate your time and you being here. It's good to see you again. I'd really like to come up to Colorado to visit sometime, but just have to see when that works out. I don't know.
We would love to have you come back.
I'm not sure how far behind enemy lines I want to get.
I completely understand. And we have a place for you to stay, by the way. So if you come up, we've got a little apartment downstairs and its own bathroom and bedroom and a little kitchenette. So be delighted to have you come.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yep.
All right. Well, everybody be blessed. And I thank you for being here. You guys are the reason that we do these conversations, and you always make it more interesting.
Thank you, Jon.
Be blessed.
Thanks, Jon. Thanks, Jay.